The collar did not spark when he touched it, which was how Jonah knew the market's power grid was failing again, and how he knew the moment would cost him more than credits. The hall smelled of heated resin and old incense while lanterns glowed amber along arches that hid the city's sky. 3 women stood before him in quiet symmetry, their hands folded the way captives were taught to fold them to look harmless. Their eyes were steady, not pleading, and that steadiness unnerved him more than chains ever could. Jonah had come to buy silence, passage, and a way out, but the auctioneer's chant had turned his stomach. He remembered the rule he kept breaking, that mercy was a debt that came due with interest. Still he raised his hand and spoke a number that made the crowd hiss. The purchase cleared with a tone like a bell rung underwater. When the collars dimmed, he felt a small breath of relief that tasted like fear. He told himself he would release them before the next gate, and that would be the end. The central woman watched him, as if she already knew he was lying to himself. They walked together through the side corridors where traders kept their ledgers and guards pretended not to see anything. Jonah keyed the lock on the first collar and waited for the spark that never came. Metal petals opened and fell to the floor with a soft sound that made him flinch. He stepped back to give space, the way a rescuer is taught even when no one taught him anything. The woman inclined her head and said nothing, which somehow made the act heavier. He freed the second collar and the third with the same careful slowness. Only then did he speak, his voice hoarse and practical, as if naming facts could make them smaller. "You are free," he said, and the word echoed too loudly. The women did not run, and did not cry, and did not ask for more. They looked at one another, and then at him, as if measuring. Jonah felt the old heat of consequence coil in his chest. Outside the market, the air was cool and smelled of rain carried from the upper terraces. He pointed toward the transit lifts and explained the routes like a man reading a map to himself. The left lift goes to the ports, the right to the commons, and from there, anywhere. He offered them a pouch of credits and a slate with a translation mesh. The woman in the center took the slate and studied it with a scholar's focus. Her sisters watched the city with expressions that were not wonder but assessment. When she spoke, her accent folded the words into a cadence he had never heard. "We thank you, Jonah of the outer lanes," she said, and used his name without asking. He stiffened and told himself it was a guess or a scan. The smallest sister smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, just knowingly. The rain began to fall thin and bright. They did not leave. Instead, the central woman turned the slate toward him and displayed a sigil that made his breath catch. It was old and forbidden, a crest burned into memory by news feeds and whispered warnings. Jonah shook his head and laughed once, because denial is a reflex. "That mark is a forgery," he said, and felt the lie scrape his throat. The woman held his gaze with a patience that felt royal, even without a throne. "We are of that house," she said, and the city seemed to lean closer. The youngest sister lifted her hands and the rain bent around her palms. Power hummed low like a storm deciding where to break. Jonah understood then that freedom was not the end of a story but the beginning of a reckoning. He also understood that he had just changed the balance of a war he never meant to touch. Sirens wailed somewhere far and near at once, and the lights flickered. Jonah's mind ran through exits, contingencies, favors owed, and favors he would never collect. He had freed 3 women, and in doing so he had bound himself to something vast. The central woman stepped closer and lowered her voice so only he could hear. "Our mother will seek us," she said, "and those who sold us will burn. But you," she continued, "will be weighed by what you choose next." Jonah felt the old stubborn ember that had carried him across dead routes flare alive. He nodded once because it was all he could offer. "Tell me how to keep you safe," he said, and meant it. The sisters exchanged a look that carried a lifetime of trust. Then they began to walk with him into the rain. The city's underways swallowed them in sound and shadow. Jonah keyed a door that was not on any map and led them into a service spine. He talked as they moved, explaining the routes, the sensors, the blind spots he had learned by bleeding. The sisters listened and asked questions that cut to the bone of systems. They were not frightened, and they were not naive. He wondered what it took to raise daughters under a crown of enemies. A tremor ran through the floor as patrols surged above. The youngest sister placed her hand on the wall, and the tremor softened. Jonah stared and then shook himself back into motion. "We will need allies," he said, already planning. The central woman smiled, and the smile carried dawn. They reached his ship, an old cutter patched with hope and clever theft. Jonah powered up, and the engines answered like tired animals willing to try. He strapped in and offered the others the same. The sisters moved with the grace of people used to gravity changing its mind. As the bay doors opened, Jonah felt the weight of eyes on the hull. He did not look back because some things only get worse when named. The cutter slipped free, and the city fell away into lights. In the quiet between alarms, the central woman spoke again. "We are not only daughters," she said, "we are keys." Jonah swallowed and set a course that cut the stars at an angle. He had bought freedom and found destiny instead. Jonah kept his hands light on the controls as the cutter threaded the debris lanes, listening to the ship hum like it remembered kinder skies. The sisters sat behind him unbuckled and calm while the stars slid into thin lines, their reflections painting their faces with passing light. He asked names because names anchor people and because silence was starting to weigh on him. The eldest said Aurelian, which sounded like a promise made of metal and sun. The middle said Ceres, which rang like water struck by bells. The youngest smiled before speaking Nyx, and the name dimmed the cabin for a breath. Jonah stored the names away with care, the way he stored fuel when runs were lean. They asked him nothing yet, which made him more uneasy than questions. The first pursuit flare bloomed behind them like a red thought he could not unthink. Jonah cut power and drifted, trusting the cutter's old skin and the junk halo to hide them. Ceres reached out without asking and laid 2 fingers on the console. The sensors blurred and the flare slid past, confused and hungry. Jonah stared, then nodded once in thanks, because gratitude works better when it is not loud. They waited until the danger passed, and then Nyx laughed softly like relief, learning it could breathe. Aurelian met Jonah's eyes, and something passed there that felt like assessment becoming respect. They jumped twice more, and then set down on a rockport that pretended to be neutral. Jonah knew the dockmaster and the price of quiet, and paid both without haggling. The sisters disembarked into air that smelled of oil and salt and old music. Crowds moved around them, and did not touch, as if a current flowed outward. Jonah felt it too, and wondered how many rooms the presence would fill before someone noticed. They took a booth in a dim cantina where the walls drank sound. Jonah ordered water and bread because beginnings should be simple. Aurelian spoke first and did not waste time with ceremony. They had been taken during a treaty visit, betrayed by a minor house that thought itself clever. The collars were meant to be proof of leverage, a crown held hostage by the market. Jonah listened and counted the costs in his head while the city breathed around them. Ceres explained the keys not as magic but as authority encoded into flesh and oath. Doors would open for them or fail to exist where they stood. Nyx added that keys attract hands and knives in equal measure. Jonah leaned back and considered the map of choices shrinking fast. Returning them would light a beacon and invite fleets he could not outrun. Hiding them would rot his soul and end the same. Helping them reclaim their mother would set a fire he could ride or burn in. He asked the practical question then because it mattered. "What do you need from me right now?" he said, and felt the weight of it settle. Aurelian smiled again, that dawn smile that made futures seem possible. They needed passage through a ring gate sealed by ancient compacts. They needed witnesses who would carry word beyond censors. They needed a human hand because humans were not bound by the old accords. Jonah felt the HFY truth he had lived all his life rise like a spine. Humans slipped through cracks because they learned to live in them. He nodded and started making calls to people who owed him and people he trusted. The plan formed not as a grand design but as a path of stepping stones. Trouble arrived wearing uniforms and polite smiles. The cantina door closed and the sound vanished like a held breath. Jonah's fingers flexed, and he did not reach for anything yet. Nyx's eyes darkened, and the room seemed to lean away from the guards. Aurelian stood slowly and spoke a single word that tasted like command. The leader faltered, and the others mirrored him like reflections unsure of their source. Ceres met Jonah's gaze and tilted her head, a fraction inviting trust. Jonah stood too and placed himself half a step in front without thinking. "We are leaving," he said in a voice he used only once or twice a year. The guards tried to remember their orders and failed. They walked out into the port lights with no one stopping them. Outside, Jonah exhaled and laughed because fear needs air to go somewhere. He guided them toward the cutter, already planning the next jump. Behind them, the city resumed its noise as if nothing had happened. Back aboard the cutter, Jonah sealed the hatch and powered up. He felt the story tightening like a sail catching wind. Aurelian placed her hand over his, on the throttle, brief and steady. "You chose well," she said, and the words felt earned, not given. Jonah set the course for the ring gate and pushed the engines. Stars stretched, and the future opened like a door that knew his name. He did not look back this time either. The ring gate rose from the dark like a crown laid on its side, vast and patient, its inner surface alive with faint glyphs that pulsed as the cutter approached. Jonah felt the hum through his boots and into his bones, a vibration older than any human charter. Traffic lights winked warnings in colors that meant nothing to him and everything to machines that remembered promises. Aurelian stood beside him and watched the gate as if greeting an ancestor. Saris murmured adjustments to the NAV solution that made the instruments settle. Nyx leaned against the bulkhead and listened to something only she could hear. Jonah breathed and trusted the craft and the women and his own stubborn luck. The first challenge came as a voice that filled the cockpit without sound. It named compacts and eras and conditions that predated Jonah's language. He answered with his registry, and a human shrug translated into data. Saris placed her palm on the console, and the voice paused like a thought interrupted. Aurelian spoke next, and the gate brightened as if the word had weight. Jonah did not understand the language, but he felt the intent pass clean and sharp. Permission arrived not as consent, but as absence of refusal. They crossed, and the stars changed character, sharper and colder, arranged in patterns that felt watched. Jonah steadied the cutter and let the engines cool while the sensors recalibrated. Behind them the gate dimmed and closed like an eye returning to sleep. Aurelian exhaled and rested her forehead against the glass. Saris checked a slate and nodded once. Nyx smiled to herself and the cabin shadows softened. Jonah allowed himself a grin that faded as the scope filled with contacts. Ships gathered at range like birds on a wire, hulls bearing marks of houses Jonah had only heard whispered. Some hailed and some did not, and that difference mattered. Jonah opened a channel and spoke plain. He told them what he carried without naming it, and what he sought without pleading. Silence answered first, and then a single acknowledgement from an old freighter captain. Others followed, and the wire shook as wings unfolded. The sisters exchanged looks that held gratitude and steel. They met in a neutral orbit where debris glittered like frost. Delegates appeared as light and shadow and translated presence. Accusations flew like sparks, and Jonah stood in the middle, absorbing heat. He spoke of markets and collars and a city that pretended not to see. He did not embellish and did not soften the truth. Saris added records that sang with authenticity. Aurelian spoke last, and the room bent around her words. The revelation landed with a soundless impact. Treaties cracked where they were weakest. Allies found their spines and enemies measured exits. Nyx laughed once bright and dangerous. Jonah felt the midpoint shift the way weather does before a storm. This was no longer a rescue but a reckoning. He wondered if there was still time to choose less fire. A strike came anyway, swift and surgical. Drones spilled into orbit and the neutral space shattered. Jonah hauled the cutter around and burned hard. Saris guided countermeasures that felt like chess played at speed. Nyx sang under her breath and the drones lost cohesion. Aurelian anchored the chaos with calm command. Jonah trusted and flew. They broke contact bruised but intact and fled toward a system that glowed like a promise kept. In the quiet that followed, Jonah felt the cost settle heavy. Lives had tipped because of his choice and more would follow. Aurelian placed a hand on his shoulder and did not speak. Saris met his eyes and nodded as if sealing an oath. Nyx leaned forward and peered at the stars. The path ahead had narrowed and sharpened, and there was no turning aside. The system they fled toward was quiet in the way oceans are quiet before weather, its star pale and steady, its planets spaced with deliberate care. Jonah cut the engines at the edge of the heliopause and let momentum carry them, listening to the tick of cooling metal. He tasted iron at the back of his throat and named it resolve because naming things helps. Aurelian stood at the forward glass and studied the orbits as if reading a score. Ceres pulled data from old beacons that answered like elders waking. Nyx traced patterns on the bulkhead that made the ship feel less alone. The cutter drifted and waited for permission from no one. They chose a moon with scars like writing, a place that remembered sieges and survived them. Jonah sat down among basalt ribs and powered the ship into silence. The air was thin and cold and carried the smell of stone. Aurelian knelt and pressed her palm to the ground, and the moon answered with a low thrum. Ceres unpacked a case that hummed with compact energy and set it carefully. Nyx walked the perimeter counting shadows and smiling at nothing. Jonah watched the sky and marked trajectories with a pilot's instinct. The plan formed under pressure the way diamonds do. They would call the crown without calling it and force a meeting without asking. Jonah would be bait because humans were believable and disposable to the arrogant. Ceres would carry proof like a blade hidden in cloth. Nyx would bend attention away from the edges where knives wait. Aurelian would speak once and end arguments that had gone on too long. Jonah accepted his role because it fit his shape. Signals went out layered and careful. Responses came faster than comfort allowed. Fleets aligned at distance pretending coincidence. Jonah paced the cutter counting steps and breathing with the engines. He thought of the market and the collars and the sound they made when they fell. He wondered how many small mercies add up to a war. He wondered if mercy ever asks permission. The first arrivals cut the sky with light. Hulls like spears and shields and ancient animals took their places. Jonah opened channels and spoke the simple truth again. He felt eyes settle on him like weather fronts. Ceres released the records and they rippled outward undeniable. Nyx softened the fury that followed just enough to keep it from exploding. Aurelian waited. The queen arrived without spectacle and that was the spectacle. Space folded politely and unfolded into presence. Jonah's knees wanted to bend and did not. Aurelian stepped forward and the air learned the meaning of home. No accusations were spoken because proof had already done the work. Silence stretched and then broke like ice. Judgment began. The minor house tried to flee and found doors missing. Markets went dark in shame and fear. Orders rippled and fleets stood down or stood ready. Jonah felt the risk crest and break around him. Aurelian spoke of consequences not revenge and the tone mattered. Ceres bound oaths with clarity that left no room to wriggle. Nyx smiled and the knives went away. When it was done the moon felt warmer. Jonah leaned against the cutter and laughed until it hurt. Aurelian approached and touched his shoulder again grounding him. You stood when it mattered she said and the words were enough. He nodded and wiped his face because heroes are just people with timing. Above them the fleets dispersed like birds satisfied. The path narrowed one last time toward an ending that could hold. The quiet after judgment felt fragile as glass, and Jonah treated it the same way, carefully and without sudden moves. He sat on the cutter's ramp and watched the moon's long shadows stretch while systems powered down across the sky. The air smelled cleaner now, or maybe that was relief rewriting memory. Aurelian stood beside him without ceremony, her presence steady and human in its patience. Ceres catalogued outcomes on her slate, already shaping the future with precision. Nyx lay on the stone and traced constellations only she could see. Jonah breathed and let the weight settle where it belonged. They stayed long enough to ensure the quiet would hold. Envoys came and went bearing apologies dressed as policy. Jonah answered questions and declined offers with equal politeness. He learned that courage looks ordinary when it lasts. Aurelian met with her mother beyond sight and returned changed but unbroken. Ceres smiled more easily and slept without waking to alarms. Nyx laughed often now, and the shadows followed her kindly. When departure came it arrived softly. The cutter lifted and the moon receded into memory. Jonah plotted a course that did not run from anything anymore. He felt older and lighter in the same breath. Aurelian watched the stars and spoke of rebuilding without spectacle. Ceres spoke of laws that could bend without breaking. Nyx spoke of songs that would be sung quietly and endure. They reached a port where no one stared. Jonah refueled and paid fare and lingered because he could. Aurelian thanked him without crowns or titles, and that mattered most. Ceres clasped his forearm in a grip that promised mutual roads. Nyx kissed his cheek and left a warmth that stayed. They parted not as savior and saved but as allies choosing distance. Jonah watched them go and smiled. He flew on afterward, carrying a story he did not need to tell loudly. Markets would change and treaties would remember. Human hands would keep finding cracks and turning them into doors. Jonah returned to the lanes with a steadier heart. He kept the sound of falling collars like a compass. Freedom remained a debt worth paying. The stars opened and he went on.